Warning, this is one of the worst keyboards ever made. Harsh language is used accordingly and liberally. If that prospect bothers you, perhaps your best course would be to tread lightly. Everyone else, please enjoy. Hello and welcome to this review of my Datalux Space Saver. Why must I do this? I've had this keyboard for about a year and a half, but I haven't reviewed it so far, frankly, out of pure stark terror. It's bad. Oh god, it's bad. The worst by far are the switches, which got a podium finish in my worst switches of all time video, but I'll dither a little bit so I don't have to touch them for a while yet. But there's plenty of other stuff to complain about, such as the layout. A lot of people recently have been asking me whether I could review this rather similar looking thing, the Chassipot C1000, or whatever the hell you're supposed to pronounce it as. As you can see, it's got a pretty horrendous layout, so I guess people wanted me to torture myself with that one as well. And I just said to myself, that's the best you can do, mate. This thing uses a similar layout, except seemingly even worse. It's basically a 60% with the F keys, nav cluster and numpad stuck on top, ostensibly allowing one to retain these functions with dedicated buttons while keeping the horizontal dimension limited. Sounds fair, right? Well, no, it's about as useful as tits on a teacup. It's more cumbersome to reach over your keyboard than to have them next to you. Even a separate numpad like this is better. Also, the decision to make the keyboard especially deep like this is useless for almost all purposes. A desktop PC is wide enough that a full-size or TKL wouldn't break free from it, and the laptop would have to be too far away for you because of the keyboard's depth. It won't fit in most trays either because of how ridiculously tall this thing is, even though they do have a much flatter model, which is intended for trays. Might save myself a few dozen comments by mentioning that. And speaking of which, because it's so tall, almost as tall as my fist, yet not very big, it's got a bizarre angle to it. I mean, look at the slope on some parts of this thing. It's worse than a battleship. What the flying flamingo fuck? And yes, before you ask, it's very uncomfortable to type uphill like this. Perhaps it comes as no surprise then that the keyboard doesn't include any flip-out feet. There are also versions of this keyboard with a glide point trackpad where the arrow keys are, which must be terrific as well. Who would want to reach over their keyboard to use a trackpad, suspending their arm over the keyboard in the meantime? Maybe you're supposed to hold up your arm with the other one or something. Especially at the loss of the arrow keys, which are probably the most useful keys apart from the alphanumeric block anyway, this edition seems very much not worth it to me, and this does not look like a nice layout to use the numpad's arrow keys on. The keycaps are not necessarily bad actually, but very weird. They're MX compatible, believe it or not, and they're thin PBT with dye-sublimed legends. However, the lettering is in italics and their shape is kind of bizarre. They're not square like other keycaps, but they're shallower front to back than they're lengthwise. As Lovecraft would have put it, the geometry is all wrong. In fact, it's almost the opposite of what other keycaps normally look like. Pinched on the sides, yet longer in the vertical. The enter key is bizarrely enlarged as well. It's like they wanted to put a big-ass enter on the keyboard, but then found out that there wasn't any space for it, so they made it twice as tall instead. Who does that? I mean, what's the point of making keycaps taller? I've never ever seen anything like this before. I've seen examples of keycaps that are shorter to avoid them getting in the way, but making something taller to be more in the way is just bizarre. Let's call it a tall-ass enter. And finally, I guess I can't put their infinite assness off any longer, the switches, which are MEI T-15. They're named after Datalux's old name, Mechanical Enterprises, I'm guessing the I in MEI is silent, and are actually a fairly old design. The patent was filed in 1988. It's one of the worst switch designs in history, evidenced by how Datalux upgraded the boards at some point by changing the switches to Cherry ML. That's right. Upgraded to Cherry ML, which are themselves basically dick-shitting clunge sponge level. And yet, this is a significant upgrade over these as well, which should give you a clue about the immense caliber of these detestable shit cannons. The general idea uses a fairly ludicrous way of closing the contacts, which consist of two rails running along the sides of the switch. The ones in this keyboard appear to be the more common version from what I can tell, based off of admittedly limited information. It uses an orange... rubber band, there's really no other way I can think of to describe it, which you mush together until it deforms so much that a conductive carbon strip stuck to the side connects both ends of one of the rails, closing the circuit. Yeah, that's right. Sometimes the rubber band stretches to both sides, by the way, allowing it to function like a double-pole single-throw switch. The other design, which appears to use a colorless band instead, pushes on a rubber tube with a coil spring inside, which again deforms and pushes against the contacts. Well, I guess I can't fault them for being unoriginal. The biggest problem with this design is that the rubber band is basically a large slab of pure mush that you're pressing down on, and as you can imagine, this is pretty much funest for key feel. It's like pressing on rubber domes, except not hollow ones, but ones made out of solid rubber. Think of it like typing on silly putty. It's fucking awful. What the hell were they thinking? What yeast-infected fuckstrumpet came up with this? According to the Deskthority wiki, it's a linear switch with a travel of about 3 mm, which sounds about right as it feels unnaturally short. Actuation happens at around 70 grams of force and it bottoms out at 105, so it's really stiff. Something that's to be expected, I guess, when you design a switch around deforming a block of rubber. I guess at this point it wouldn't surprise you when I say that the key feels also very scratchy and rough, but it's worse than anything you could possibly imagine. You know how Cherry MX Brown are so non-tactile they feel more like scratchy reds? Well, these are the exact opposite. These switches, apparently classed as linear, are so scratchy that they actually feel somewhat tactile. Cinnamon smoking Jesus Christ on a home trainer, what a fecal fiasco. Or, as my mother would call it, a pus-oozing pimple cunt. It's hard to describe in words just how unpleasant this switch is. It's so bad that I can honestly only use it for short periods of time before my fingers and joints start screaming in pain from how much effort it takes to press these switches. I'm not even kidding, this keyboard genuinely hurts to use. Just great, absolutely fucking magnificent. I hope whatever evolutionary dead end of a Homo sapien came up with this switch design never gets to work on a keyboard again, because these switches are of such an awe-inspiring, industrial strength fuckness that is liable to shatter one's mind upon the merest touch. If you ever encounter one of these, I recommend immediate defenestration, lest one accidentally gets traumatized by this amputated foreskin. That's it for this review. I hope you enjoyed it because I suffered a lot for it. See you next time, and following is a typing demonstration of me typing on this prolapsed vagina.